intro.
Mhm.
It's a pleasure to welcome our Cybersecurity Subcommittee and Technology Committee participant and member, Debbie Reynolds. Debbie, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for speaking at our Lunch and Learn.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, Gail. It's a pleasure to be able to do this. I did one last year on Flock, and as we know, Google abandoned that and they came up with something new. So today I'm talking about the new things and sort of its implications on kind of what's happening on the internet, because obviously Google has their paws in a lot of data things, and including things around search and operating systems on phones and different things, devices, stuff like that. So it's pretty important. So let's go to the next slide. So people know me already, so I'll go to the next slide. All right, so there are lots and lots of people on the internet. As of 2021, there's about 4.6 billion people on the internet and counting. There are a lot more, will be billions more probably in the next, I don't know, 2 to 5 years. We're seeing a lot more countries that are getting more kind of cell capabilities and internet capabilities. So a lot of what the digital transformation that's happening in a lot of countries revolve around kind of phones and trying to get people connected to the internet. So the worldwide data privacy regulation is increasing exponentially. We're seeing obviously in the EU lots of laws being passed around kind of digital privacy and rights of individuals, as well as putting more obligations on businesses with how they handle data and how they communicate with regulators about how they handle data. So that's not going to stop. We're seeing a lot of regulations, not only in in Europe and Brazil, all over the world, but also in the US. So, and on the state level in the US, there are lots of states that are trying to pass like more comprehensive data privacy regulations. There are states that have already succeeded in that. So California, Virginia, Colorado, those are the three big states that we think about when we think about more comprehensive data privacy regulation. And of course, New York is in the mix with their SHIELD Act, which is more around kind of cybersecurity and safety and protection. But that also kind of dovetails into privacy. Touch on that. Also, I wanted to mention, probably because I'm biased, I am in the state of Illinois. So Illinois has the Biometric Information Privacy Act, which is currently the most stringent biometric law in the world right now. So a lot of people are looking to see what's happening there. And we're actually seeing a lawsuit filed in the state of Texas by the Texas AG against Facebook for facial recognition. So I think we're going to see a lot more states, Illinois got paid in a settlement from Facebook for kind of facial recognition technology that they used to use. And so I think they got, the settlement was like $650 million. So I think other states saw that, and I think we're gonna see a lot of states try to pass laws like that. Because they're like, hey, we want $650 million.
Right, Debbie, if I can ask you, so that one of the distinguishing factors about Texas and also I believe it's Washington State, their biometric acts only allow enforcement by the Attorney General, right? So there's no private right of action. Do you think we're going to keep seeing more of those kinds of AG enforcement, which is also interestingly, the SHIELD Act is the same way, or are we going to see more private right of action statutes, or a mix, do you think?
I think it may end up being a mix, but I think this biometric law in Illinois snuck past people. No one was paying attention when it was passed. So I think if people were paying attention, they probably would have fought harder against this. So I think we'll probably see more AG type enforcement laws passed. Maybe that's easier passed, I'm not sure. But definitely people will pass these laws, especially if they know that they can get more money for their
Right.
state.
You think Washington State, the third time's going to be the charm on the privacy law that's pending?
You know, I don't know. I know that there's a lot of lobbying going on. You know, they don't want this to pass, and you know, if it passes, maybe it'll be more watered down. Yeah, so it just sort of remains to be seen what's going to happen with that. But you know, there are so many states that are trying to pass these laws, and so you know, this is kind of a state by state battle at this point about how who goes first and who gets the most attention.
Right.
Great question. All right, so third-party data. So the problem with third-party data is that, and we're seeing this not only in regulation, but also in the consensus around individuals about how their data is shared. So when an individual gives their data to a company, they don't want it sent to another company without their consent or their knowledge. So what we're seeing in places like the EU with the General Data Protection Regulation, they're putting in stipulations within these laws to say, you know, if you're a first party data holder and you transfer data to a third party, you have to definitely document that stuff. But in some cases, you have either can't transfer it or you need the person's consent to do that transfer. Sorry, I can't believe I sneezed. You need the person's consent to do that transfer. And what it's creating is their skin in the game, right, for the first party data holder and the third party data holder. So right now, the way things are going, a first party data holder can't say, you know, I gave this data to a third party, and if they do something bad with it, then you're not responsible. You know, so the laws are like, well, you are responsible because, you know, did you take, you know, reasonable measures and steps to make sure that, you know, first of all, limiting the data that you give to the third party, and then making sure, you know, whether it's contractual or whatever, that you're holding your third parties to account, whether that's sort of the audits or checkups or in some way. So basically, a lot of these laws are really trying to put a lot more regulation and a lot more emphasis on what happens to data that goes to a third party. There's also a cyber risk with third parties. So depending on who the third parties are, I don't know, I think the third party and first party thing is like a finger pointing, like, you know, it's your responsibility. No, it's your responsibility. So this is what a lot of these laws are trying to sort out. So there is risk there. And then so there has to be a way for first parties and third parties to try to assess that risk, especially as it relates to cyber. There's revenue risk for companies to sell third party data and advertising. So we saw recently, there was a news story, I think I posted about it on LinkedIn, where analysts had estimated that as a result of Apple's app transparency privacy change they made to their operating system, that companies that sell advertising lost like $270 billion or something within a very short amount of time. So people are looking really closely at this, especially as it relates to investing in companies that do this kind of third-party data sharing without consent. And then there's steep fines in different parts of the world. So there are fines in places like the EU, which can be a percentage of a company's revenue. I think up to 4% of someone's revenue. There are these in the US, there's kind of these state by state laws. You know, we talked about California, Colorado, and Virginia, even though they may have a mix of sort of AG enforcement or private right of action, but it's still not great, especially if you're collecting data for a purpose. Let's say you collect data for one purpose and decide to use it for another purpose, that's being called out. Also, if you're collecting data that's of a sensitive nature, so most of these laws have different requirements for companies that collect that type of data, and then sort of this data transfer to a third party. All right, so limiting third-party data transfer risk. So Apple has already done their move on the chessboard around this third-party data risk issue. So basically what they did is for advertisers, they opted everyone out of sort of advertising, have to opt in. And as of this date, I think they said less than 5% of people opted in to advertising. So this is like a major blow for people who sell ads if they can't develop a first party relationship with them. So third parties, as a result of this type of change that they're doing, and I'll talk a little bit about Google. Actually, most of the presentations about Google and what they're doing. The advertisers will be given sort of less granular data about individuals. So instead of saying, you know, Gail drives a red pickup truck if she lives in, you know, on Main Street, it'll be, you know, someone who lives in New York bought a pickup truck.
Right.
So,
Debbie, can I ask you a question? So we heard about these great drops in, you know, how it hit Facebook and other companies, these changes. But do you think it's an indication of consumer choice, like people rejecting increased data sharing or asserting their rights? Or is it just the fact that if you require someone to take an affirmative step, very few people are going to do it, but if you make it passive, you know, you'll get a higher number? What do you think it means? Because it's hard. I'd love to imagine that so many people became concerned about data privacy and data sharing that they, you know, they embraced Apple's new stance and rejected data sharing. But I suspect it's more just that they had to take an affirmative step, and people just don't. You're less likely to get people to do that, to opt in.
I guess it is a bit of both. So it is, you know, I think the number would have been more even, or sort of more people would have done it if it wasn't done for them. Is that the right way to say it? So yeah. I think people are lazy. So the fact that Apple opted people out meant that that's a just thing that they didn't have to do. And so if people really wanted it, they have to put some effort into doing it. So only 5% of people wanted to do that. People thought that Apple was gonna do it the other way, where they say, okay, you have access to all this advertising, and then the person has to opt out. So the fact that they made it opt in, which is very similar to the way that the EU laws are, you have to opt in. People are really shocked about that. So I think we're seeing, you know, so both, to me, it tells me that people need help, right? People like the fact that they don't have to fight their way through, you know, 80 pages of privacy policy and click 1,000 times to not be bothered by marketers, right? So I think it's both.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the point, and we see this in Europe too, of the power of default settings, right? You know, like if the default setting is that you're going to get it unless you opt out, people are just not going to take the time, so they're going to stick with the default setting. But when the default setting is that you have to take an affirmative act to opt in, people are going to say, what? No, I don't want to do that. Or only 5%, a much smaller percentage of people are going to think it through and say, yeah, I want it the old way. I'm going to take an affirmative step to do it. So I think it's an interesting point about just how powerful default settings are.
I agree with that. So at first I thought, okay, they did this thing. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to spend some time and go through my phone and do the settings. And I saw, oh, it's already like shut off for me. Great. You know, I just went to move to the other thing.
Because you didn't expect it, which really speaks to, you know, approaches to privacy as well, right? That the default was that you were in, you know, you were going to get all this tracking and this advertising. It's an interesting thought.
It is totally. I call it the Amazon effect. So that Amazon is $1 trillion company because people are just lazy, right? We're like, oh, this is convenient. Let me press this button and it comes to my door. So it's the same way. So third parties will be forced. So if third parties can't get this data, you know, through third party data sharing, they'll have to find new ways to get data. So one way will be trying to create a first party relationship with a consumer so that you can get more information. All right. So Google Analytics. So Google Analytics has been in the news lately because there was a ruling that came out of Europe. I think it was France, if I'm not mistaken, said that they thought that the use of Google Analytics by websites in Europe is illegal. So this is like a big deal. People are looking at this ruling very closely. So basically, just to let you know what Google Analytics is. So Google Analytics is sort of a service that websites can use to track stuff about what's happening on their website. So traffic, sales, stuff like that. So it is the most widely used web analytics service on the internet, and it's sort of an opt-in exercise. So you have to decide that you want to use this particular tool. So the issue that Europe had with Google Analytics is that they felt like, and a lot of this has to do with kind of the Cloud Act and their idea about surveillance and the data that goes back to the US. They want to have more cloud services and things in Europe, and they want to stop the kind of what I call passive data transfer of data to the US if it's not necessary. So they're trying to either get people to not use Google Analytics or use another program, or they're trying to get Google to store the analytics in a way that it doesn't call back to the US. So I think there's a lot of head scratching because people don't really know what to do. For me, I have kind of technical issues about this whole thing, which I could talk about that for a whole hour. That's another story, but I think people are wondering what to do right now. Basically, I think what people are doing is they are either deciding they want to change to a different analytics package that can tell them or give them some assurance that they're not transferring data to the US through the analytics, or they're not doing anything. So I think most people just aren't doing anything at this point. So let's see the next slide. All right, so I just talked about this. So let's see. Yeah, so I just talked about it. So right, businesses either are going to wait to see probably what's going to happen. Google hasn't said they're going to do anything. I don't know if they will do anything. I think as a result of when the GDPR passed, I'm a Google Analytics user and a geek and a webmaster. And so when GDPR passed in 2016, I thought, okay, great. So Google's gonna create all these tools to help people to manage kind of their data, and that just didn't happen. As a matter of fact, what Google did is they pushed more data to the individual. So this is kind of the sucks to be you version of what's happening with Google Analytics. So people have no one that I know of who wants to put up a website wants to be in this turf war, right, between EU, US. They just want their website to work. So it's kind of a tough place for businesses to be in, and they just have to decide kind of what's their level of risk in that area. All right, next slide. All right, so the Google Privacy Sandbox. So last year, Google announced that they were going to try to do away with a third-party cookie. So there are a lot of litigation in Europe that has been for years over cookies, which is a method that third-party advertisers use to sort of track information about individuals. So because of these lawsuits, these tech companies are trying to get rid of sort of that third-party tracking. So Apple, with their app transparency, that's basically what they've done. It's about third-party data tracking. So Google is trying to do a similar thing, but not really. So basically what Google is trying to do is limit their third-party risk by coming up with a way that advertisers can still make some money, not as much as they did before with data that they request from Google, but then also create some bit more anonymity with users. So Google will stop within 2 years of giving advertisers every single thing that they collect, or, that they want to buy about people. So it's going to be a little bit more not individual, more sort of group focused. So I could talk about sort of what this replacement is. So currently Google has this thing called a Google tracking ID. So the tracking ID, so say you have an Android device, and just to let you know, statistically, 85% of mobile phones use the Android operating system. So it's not an insignificant number of people, and 90% of apps on Android phones are free. So if you're not paying in return from you, right? So when you use a Android system phone, it has something called a GAID, which is the Google ad tracking, and basically it's sort of your identifier like all over the web. So when you search for stuff, download apps, advertisers, they can not only see the stuff that you're doing with them, they can see other things that you're doing. So this is, when people find out about it, they're not happy about it and they want to see more changes, sort of like what Apple did with app transparency. This is more of a middle ground. Google also sells advertising, so it's would not be good on their part to hurt themselves by doing something like this, right? So the parts of that they did, so they're going to eliminate the GID, which is this individual, more granular advertising, and they're going to replace it with 4 different things. So I'll run through what these 4 things are. So one is called Topics. So Topics is a way for Google to present information to advertisers about people that they possibly want to market to. So instead of saying, Gail likes, I don't know, what do you like, Gail? So Gail likes to go walks on the beach, right? So maybe she wants a vacation. So
I do want a vacation.
She wants to have a vacation of some sort. So instead of the advertiser going, okay, Gail searched to vacation stuff and she wants to go to Cancun or wherever, they'll say, okay, Gail is part of a group of people who are interested in learning about vacations. Okay, so it's sort of like Flock, where they're trying to roll people up. I was going to say, this sounds just like
Flock. Yeah. Flock by another name.
Yeah, it's Flock by another name, but they're not trying to identify the person. So basically they're going to aggregate it in a way where, okay, the advertiser comes in and they say, okay, people who like this will, expose you to those people without letting you know who those people are. So it's really for advertisers that are looking for new people. And then Fledge is alternative to how advertisers retarget people. So let's say Gail bought this vacation package to Cancun last year. Right now that marketer can marketers like them can retarget you and say, hey, we're a different company, but we saw that you went to Cancun, so now we're going to give you all these ads. So this retargeting is also a problem with third-party cookies. So basically they're creating this thing called Fledge, which is sort of another pool, to say, okay, this person who lives in New York, who likes vacations, last year they bought a vacation, but we're not going to tell you who it is. But if you want to target ads to them, we'll let you do that. So that's what Fledge is. And then attribution reporting. So this is where a lot of the money in marketing is made. And so if you think about when you go on the internet, and let's say you go on the internet, you look for a shirt on a website and you close that website, you open another website and you see an ad for that same shirt and it chases you around the internet. So basically what happens when that is going on is that an advertiser has bid in the background to show you an ad. They won the bid right in the background. And then if you purchase that product within a certain amount of time, they get credit for it as if they were the person that was responsible for you buying the shirt. So there's a lot of money to be made in attribution. So because the way that Google's going to do the ads now, those companies won't be able to get that type of granular information. So they won't know, okay, Gail bought this shirt that I showed her the ad for. They'll be able to say, you know, of 1,000 people you showed this ad to, you know, 500 bought the shirt, you know, so that's a less granular data. And then SDK runtime. So this is the part that people are going to be really looking at really closely, people like me. So SDK runtime is supposed to be this thing that Google's put together, which is going to be like a firewall on your phone. It's supposed to guard individuals against marketers looking at other things on their phone. So with my Cancun example, you know, so marketer sold, if Gail bought a trip to Cancun last year, you know, they were able to, you know, retarget her for something else, that's fine, without them knowing exactly who you are. And then let's say you decide that you want to do business with this marketer. That doesn't mean that you want to give them access to every other thing on your phone. So that's what SDK real runtime is supposed to be doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. So key points about the privacy sandbox. So they're supposed to, the point is Google is trying to reduce their third-party risk related to advertisers, and it will reduce advertisers' revenue. It won't reduce Google's revenue. It'll actually probably increase Google's revenue because Google has a huge first-party relationship with organizations, and at this point, they're becoming almost like a gatekeeper for other advertisers. So it's going to be interesting. And then what are
Debbie, can I ask you a question though? For the third-party advertisers today with AI, isn't there an argument, excuse me, that they have so much information already that they could make a lot of these inferences anyway, just based on what they have, you know, understanding that everyone wants real-time data and the latest, you know, to see if I'm looking at Miami now instead of Cancun or something like that, if only. But you know, they have so much historical data, and the way that AI now can extrapolate and make predictions, you know, it's not like we're suddenly going to be all that much safer, right? It's just they're going to have to go different routes to make these predictions, right?
Yeah,
it's going to be a little bit harder.
Yeah, probably a drone following you around, sensors everywhere, you know, in the grocery store. Yeah, so they do have a lot of data, but I think the thing is companies that sell ads can sell data that's more accurate and more up to date at a premium, right? So this is sort of eliminating that premium option, except that at this point, Google's become this gatekeeper. So they can say, you know, I know that the ad is the data I give you is less granular, but I'm going to charge you the same. Like they can do that because they're Google, basically. So I think that's, you know, this is going to be almost like the one place that people are going to have to go for ads unless they have a first party relationship with the consumer. So I think that's different. And then the privacy impact. So there's going to be a lot more focus on this kind of third party data sharing. You know, as many other laws are being passed, almost all the laws that I'm seeing that are even being discussed have a part in it related to third-party data sharing. Like people really don't want this, especially without their consent, and especially because we know that, you know, it's not just people selling shirts, it's companies creating risk models to you know, make decisions about people, like about employment or education, and that's problematic, especially if it's not transparent, which a lot of this isn't. You know, a lot of this AI is very black box, so we don't know what's happening. So I see these regulations trying to bring more transparency, but then, you know, I think the hard thing will be for companies who can't build a first party relationship. So let's say if a company is only in business to find out things about you that you would be denied coverage for something, like you probably wouldn't agree to that. So I think it'd make it harder for them to get that data, but then I'm sure they'll probably find some way to make up some data put in this place, and it may not be good or accurate. And then I think it's going to cause third-party advertisers to try to create incentives for people to give them data. So, sweepstakes, giveaways, just anything that you could possibly think of, coupons, deep discounts, or whatever. So this change is going to go into effect in 2 years. So I think between now and the next 2 years, it's going to be a data grab, basically. So I think that's it. Is that my last slide? Yeah, that's it. You have any questions?
I think that's it's fascinating, and that's been the discussion for a long time, right? Like, should people have the right to monetize their own data rather than having it just shared by something that you could argue that it's hard to avoid Google search, right? It's so ubiquitous now, you really don't have an option, so you have to do it. But that's different than, for example, some company saying, I'll give you a discount on something if I can send you advertising and I can get information from you. And that's kind of the model that we're looking to get to, right? And more of the European model, that you should be able to make that decision and you should profit from your data, not another company.
That's right. Exactly. So now it's been like a free for all, right? So, I think if some companies, if they have a choice between making like nothing or making less, they're going to make less. So that part of that making less may be trying to create these incentives that right now they didn't have to do it because they got so much data anyway.
Right. But I guess, I don't know exactly what Google charges, but you could probably make the argument now, if you start building the model, that you could probably break even or maybe do better, right? If you start building these first party relationships. I don't know how expensive Google is, but I have to imagine it's not cheap, right?
Yeah.
It's definitely another model. It's forcing people to think about revenue models and data monetization models that they wouldn't have thought of otherwise, because it was just so easy to buy it from Google.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot more talk about monetization because most people, people don't really know the value of their data, but once they start getting these incentives, they're like, hey, wait a minute, like, why would they offer me this? This data is so expensive or whatever. What is it about my data is so valuable to them? So they're gonna have to share the money or just not get any. So
yeah, it begs the question, like, if they're willing to pay Google this much for it, why they should be willing to pay me for it, right? It's not Google's personal data, it's mine. It's interesting. It goes towards that whole decentralization idea that we're seeing with Web3 discussions now too, right? That creators should be the ones to monetize their ideas and their IP and not intermediaries or middle people. It's definitely a trend.
Oh yeah, totally. It's people gonna talk about a lot more, or probably over the next 2 years, because a lot of this free for all for data, the data fire hose is being turned off.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Debbie. This has been fascinating as always. And I'm glad to know that Flock is still around, just with a different name. After you went to so much trouble to explain Flock to us. So now at least we can still keep our Flock knowledge. So thank you so much. A pleasure as always. And we will distribute this to folks. And if it's okay, we'll have them contact you directly with any questions.
Yeah, no problem. This would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian.